no secret. It's plain to see. I love you, and you love me. It's no secret. You know it's true. You love me. I love you. The only time we seem to meet is in the middle of the night. Only then can I feel your heartbeat. Till something's not right. Together I see you and me, always and all time. But not everyone would agree. To them it's a crime. It's no secret. It's plain to see. Yes, I love you, and you love me.
Hello, Yat. How are you?
Oh, great. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for joining Crypto Defined. We have with us Yat Su, and I'd like everyone in the audience to give him a big round of applause because it is 3:30 a.m. his time in Hong Kong, and he was so good-natured to join us in the middle of his night to talk about digital property rights. That's how much he loves this subject. So thank you so much, Yat. We greatly, greatly appreciate it.
Thank
Let
you
me
so
just
much.
introduce the show, and then I'd like to give our audience members a description of all that you have done in the blockchain space. So, welcome everyone to Crypto Defined. My name is Kathy Chu. I'm your host for this weekly interview series. We look at the innovators, the disruptors, and the skeptics of the crypto industry whose size has reached 3 trillion last year. Crypto Defined is put out by TruthDAO, which is the first global Web3 news organization focusing on nonpartisan, unbiased journalism. You can visit us at truthdao.xyz and join our Discord to learn more. Today's guest, we are very lucky to have, as I mentioned, is joining us from Hong Kong at 3:30 a.m. his time. And I'll keep repeating that for people so they understand that how excited he is to talk about digital property rights. Today's guest is Yat Su. Yat is a serial entrepreneur, and he's the co-founder of Animoca Brands, a pioneer in the crypto space that has more than 200 investments in firms in the NFT world or in decentralized projects. Animoca Brands is a major player in the blockchain gaming space. It has stakes in companies like Dapper Labs, OpenSea, the largest NFT platform out there, Sky Mavis, the maker of Axie Infinity, which is a blockbuster NFT game that many of you probably know if you're gamers. Yat has been an early advocate for the use of blockchain and non-fungible tokens, or NFTs, in the gaming industry to allow gamers to enjoy true ownership of their game assets, data, and equity. Yat began his career at Atari Germany in 1990 before establishing the Hong Kong Cyber City, then setting up Outblaze before founding Animoca. Quite a lot there, Yat. For it sounds like you've had 5 or 6 different careers, and I've also read that you are a trained classical musician, born to 2 musician parents who wanted you to go into music, but you decided to take a different path. Is that correct?
Yeah, that was in another life. I think the whole thing about sort of music, really, because of the fact that I grew up in a musician family, was really sort of not quite my choice in all things, right? Being an only Chinese kid in a musical family, growing up in Vienna, everything that you may have read about Asian tiger parenting, it's all true. Certainly in my case.
I grew up yet in a family of doctors, and they wanted me to be a doctor, so I turned to journalism. So it's I understand the feeling. Anyway, thank you for being here with us today, Yat. We have a lot of questions for you. We have a lot of audience questions. We really appreciate your time. So let's jump in. Let's start with what happened last week in the crypto markets, Yat, if you don't mind. That's on everyone's mind. The markets have calmed a little bit. But the meltdown of Terra USD and Luna really shook the industry. As things calm down this week, what are you thinking about what happened last week, and has that made investors and executives hesitant at all about the health of the industry?
Well, speaking quickly in terms of sort of perspective from at least investors like ourselves, and just to be clear, Animoca Brands isn't a VC in the classical sense, in the sense that we don't have LPs. So we invest out of our balance sheet. We're actually an operating company for the most part. But we continue to invest. I think I think PitchBook actually sort of said that we were apparently the most active investor in the blockchain space, apparently 2 quarters in a row. But independent of that, we continue to look at deals. We continue to invest. The team is active. I think broadly speaking, I think many of our peers are continuing to invest as well. Maybe they're going to be a little bit more cautious. Maybe they're going to sort of valuations might possibly come down. That's I think though that has very little to do with USD Terra. It has mostly to do, so Luna has mostly to do with the broader market sentiment, right? So the whole world economy was already sort of coming down a little bit, and crypto was already sort of coming down together with it, which is also interesting because I think really what it demonstrates is that crypto is starting to correlate a lot more with global economic perspectives. And I think this is an indication as well that the two units are becoming more and more correlated, as in more and more aligned, just because of the fact that it also demonstrates from our perspective more crossover between sort of the physical world and the digital world. Now, in terms of what specifically happened, I think it's been well documented already, what happened with the DPEG and so on. And I think the biggest sort of issue when it comes to stablecoins is the fact that there was no backing, right? And really, at the end of the day, Terra as a blockchain didn't have enough growth. It didn't have enough sort of network effects in and of itself. It's basically, think of it literally like a sort of a fledgling country that basically didn't have the natural backing of its own to sort of defend basically what ended up happening with Luna. So for the time being, therefore, Luna and UST were basically two entirely correlated assets between each other, which obviously then ended up being sort of, and this is the thing about blockchain, because they're entirely open frameworks, for better or for worse, they can be sort of exploited, if you will. And that's kind of, in a way, what happened, right, in a sort of Asian economic crisis style attack. And for those who have lived through this, which I was actually in Hong Kong in 1998, everything that happened to Terra basically is things that we've seen, with Thailand, and then with Korea, and then interesting enough, the attempt to also depeg Hong Kong, which failed, because what Hong Kong did was interesting is that they ended up sort of where they were in a similar pressure, but in order to shore up and defend against sort of the depegging attacks, because the Hong Kong dollar is still to this day pegged to the US dollar, they ended up buying equities. So the monetary authority and the financial sort of the sort of group here in Hong Kong started buying mass equity in companies like HSBC and so on. And they were obviously sound investments in the first place, but in so doing, essentially restored confidence and grew sort of that sort of grew confidence, and of course grew the balance sheet and defeated sort of the peg attack. I think that model was just not possible in the case of what happened to Terra, and then it sort of quickly collapsed. But from the flip side of this, if you look at, for instance, let's say if someone ever tried to sort of attack, Ethereum, for instance, or anyone tried to attack any other blockchain that was sort of not pegged to each other in this sort of correlated manner, it wouldn't have been possible. Maybe there'd be, and I think we've seen this today. I think the encouraging thing is, despite the fact that you could say a major blockchain, literally collapsed and was wiped out. The fact that Bitcoin and Ethereum are sort of holding on quite well and are more correlated to the global market, sort of where it was already sort of on the decline just because of global indexes, rather than specifically what happened to, I think, Terra, is to me an indication of the resilience of the blockchain network in and of itself, and that it hasn't really sort of had as big an impact as perhaps people feared it might. Now, for people who are not familiar with the blockchain space that I'm talking to, and many of our investors are first time sort of, let's call it, exposed to crypto through Animoca brands because they become investors in us, many of them have been nervous about this because they didn't quite understand what UST was. So it's like, oh my goodness, a stablecoin depegged. How's that possible? And so there is an element of fear, which is obviously what people are playing on when they're doing these attacks. And so is Tether next? What does it mean for Circle? Is there such thing as a stable coin, right? And that comes from not being aware of the fact that the other tokens, the other stable coins are actually sort of backed by assets or backed by actual cash. That's the one thing that they weren't familiar with. So that's basically sort of scares people a little bit. The other thing I'll say also about specifically this, which is a little bit tragic, is that it's quite contained in Korea, because Terra is a very Korean sort of centric network, not just because of the team, but because of all the people developing on it. So as a result, the fallout, in Korea is going to be far, far sort of greater, because from a national standpoint, a lot of Korean individuals have been affected, unfortunately, whereas in sort of by ratio, and so that's going to be a bigger policy agenda. So do expect, there to be a bigger fallout in Korea. And then, of course, from a global standpoint, it will lead to, regulation in terms of stablecoins. Honestly, I don't think that's a bad thing, right? Because regulating stablecoins from our perspective is actually a good thing, because its purpose really is to be ensured that are the assets actually there? Is it backed? Is the mechanism sound? Right? I mean, that's the only way I think we can grow the space, by providing confidence. And once people know that this is regulated and it's blessed by a governmental sort of authority, wherever that may be, then it'll just drive more adoption from the mass from masses and financial groups.
Yeah, you talked about that regulation of stablecoins might be a good thing. And as I've talked to people in the crypto industry over the past few weeks, I have found very few. I can't think of one that has said, we do not want any regulation. On the contrary, everyone I talked to has said, we think some regulation would be good for the space to add some clarity and certainty. Of course, the form of regulation is something that everyone's still discussing. But if the crypto industry wants to be regulated, why is there not that type of regulation yet? I mean, you rarely hear people crying for regulation, and I hear it from this industry. Why has this not happened yet?
Well, I mean, I think the biggest issue in terms of why there hasn't been much regulation is that regulators typically lag behind, right? It's very rare to have sort of regulators or any basically regulate an industry, on toward a sort of path or a future. With everything that goes in the pace of technology, actually what happens is that regulators have to regulate after the fact, right? And which is also, when you think about particularly the entrepreneurial spirit of a lot of entrepreneurs, it sort of reached that sort of mantra of, don't ask for permission, but rather ask for forgiveness, which has basically been sort of the typical type of sort of entrepreneurial approach in the tech space. Because if you wait for the regulators to sort of create a framework, then actually, two things happen. One, no progress, because the regulator is not the one that's going to say, hey, what could this industry look like? Right? That's not typically what they do. And the second one, which is probably one where more people are worried about, is that idea that you might have had. Someone else will do it for you because they just do it. So this sort of competitive spirit around that, and the competitive and entrepreneurial spirit, has led to a broader sort of thing in technology, not specifically related to blockchain, to just go ahead and just do it and then deal with the consequences later. and then hope to lobby and explain because they broadly believe it is a good thing. And we've seen this, like for instance, with things like Uber or like Airbnb, or even what's happening at Facebook, right? They just go ahead and do things, and then afterwards, regulators come back and say, hey, you can't do this, you have to organize that. This is dealing with labor unions or dealing with sort of privacy concerns. Right? And I think the same is true here. Maybe it's different arms of government, right? It's not necessarily the financial regulator in all cases, but it is still regulation.
Okay. Well, let's talk about investments for a little bit. Animoca Brands is kind of like the 10 cent of the crypto world. I think you and I have talked about with the breadth and the scope of its investments. And you and I have talked about how part of your aim is to ensure the health of the ecosystem. And that's partly why you're investing. Tell us more about how you figure out where in the NFT space you want to go and how you connect it all together. Because with your investments, more than 200, I believe, at this point, when I've listened back to your interviews, sometimes people have questions about how does that investment really relate to gaming, or how does A relate to B? So talk to us more about your philosophy, how you figure out what you're going to invest in, and if you could tell us what you're going to invest in next, we would really appreciate it.
Of course. So first of all, sort of zooming out a little bit, the thing that we really sort of are pushing towards is digital property rights. That is sort of the North Star of Animoca Brands. And what we want to see happen, which is already beginning, right, is the network effects of digital property rights become so large that it becomes impossible not to build on top of them, right? And in other words, that the economic framework of, I guess, what people now describe as the metaverse, or Web3, is so substantial that it can't be ignored, and even the largest of companies are forced open. And I would say, to some effect, we have seen this come to reality when Facebook has basically said, "Oh, we're going to support NFTs," right? And that to me is one example of the size and strength of the network effect that was built, in part because of our support, but mostly because of the community and excitement and everything around that, and the economic size. That's the thing, right? That the economic opportunity in the NFT space is so large that they can't do this because, from a network standpoint, Instagram, as in Facebook, or now known as Meta, could easily have said, "Oh, we're going to launch our own type of NFT that's within Facebook, right? And we're going to go and launch our own sort of closed version that you can sort of trade, and we're going to rebuild our own type of OpenSea, and we're going to have our own sort of digital ecosystem." After all, Facebook does have, close to 2 billion users, right? They could have easily sort of tried to at least recreate their own system that is maybe not even on chain, and yet they didn't. Because, if you look at just the last 30 days, just in terms of NFTs, close to, I think I think it was $4 billion worth of NFTs were sort of traded. And that's an interesting point as well, is that actually that volume is slightly higher from the month before, right? So it just shows that NFTs continue to grow in general in that space. So that's kind of, the effect that we're trying to build. So in other words, our investment philosophy, outside of what we do as an operator, which mostly has been known for building blockchain games or the sandbox, for instance, is that we're trying to sort of invest in anything that continues to aid in the construction of network effects of NFTs. Now, what we mean by that is that when you have digital property, or any property, it doesn't just have to be digital, the value and its utility is defined by the network effects that become embedded in them. This is true for everything. But the fact that our car has value, or more value than it did, say, in its first creation 100 years ago, is because it has lots more utility. Therefore, it has more network effects. And those added network effects allow other people to embed new services and new innovation on top, such that today, ownership of a car actually is responsible for an industry that is far greater than the sale of the car itself. Right? When you think about how many people are employed in the automotive industry, not in the making of cars, but in the support of these cars, whether it's mechanics, whether it's people who are constructing, parking lots, people who are doing, charging stations, or fuel stations, or people who are basically creating baby seats, or Uber or Lyft, right? Those economies are, significantly larger than just, Volkswagen selling cars, for instance, right? That's what this is, right? And today, what's amazing is, we cannot possibly imagine all the new additional ideas that people are continuing to innovate on top of the ownership of cars, right? That's an example of an embedded network effect. And so the car has added utility, and today is a lot more valuable, not just valuable in terms of money, but valuable to society. We need a car to do probably almost anything, especially if you live in the US. So take that zoom out a little bit and say, okay, well, if this is true for all physical ownership, then this should be true also for all digital ownership. And on blockchain, that's possible because it's openly composable, which means that we can create new innovations on top of it. The fact that I can own a physical house is the reason a bank can give me a 20 to 30 year mortgage. Well, then we've seen this with virtual property as well. But the fact that I truly own this Bored Ape or I truly own the Sandbox land, and there's certainty around that, is the reason why an NFT lending platform can exist, or someone can offer a fractionalization service, outside of its actual intended utility, and other people can use it in 10 different games, for instance. So as we keep investing in companies that help add with two drivers, one of them is and continue to expand network effects within them, which means that there's more use cases, which is why we've always been pushing interoperability as an example of extended use case. And the second one, of course, is related to adoption, right? Meaning that we also want to invest in companies that can help drive more users into Web3 and the metaverse. Because after all, we believe that it is a natural evolution of the internet, which means we still have about 4 billion people to go in terms of adoption, right? And
a lot of people.
And a lot of people who need to be made aware, who need to have tools in which they can come in more friendly or have the right incentives. Right, so that's the lens to look at it from, and because we're so broadly invested, as well as building in the space, the way we think of this is that as the space continues to grow, we will broadly benefit. We won't all benefit in the same way, right? In other words, just like in a real economy, just because, for instance, the U.S. is growing as an economy, doesn't mean that all of us are going to be equally growing in its opportunity or its sort of prosperity, but we will still all grow, right? If the US economy grows substantially, then the restaurant in your neighborhood will also grow. And again, it may not necessarily grow in the same ratio as perhaps someone who's doing more export business or someone in technology, but they'll still also grow. And so that's how when we have a broad investment portfolio, including across L1 and L2s, we end up creating a system where we can actually invest rather freely in terms of its expansion without having to focus specifically only on one or two of our projects, because we only benefit from one or two of our projects. One of the things that happen when you basically have only one thing, right? Then naturally you would end up sort of protecting the one thing if you want, right? And ideally try to sort of, at the end of the day, quasi-monopolize that. But because our philosophy is that half of our business should be operating businesses like the Sandbox, or Phantom Galaxies or Rev Racing, whatever. And the other half of a business needs to be invested in an open portfolio. What actually happens is that we will always encourage a cross-investing culture and an interoperability and open standard. Because if we end up sort of clamping down and suddenly becoming monopolistic, for instance, right, then we'll end up hurting, our other half of our portfolio and the growth related to that. So we'll always be incentivized to grow. So it's not just a philosophical thing. We want to make sure that our company, which is still an experiment in some ways, is structured in a way where we also have the economic incentive to build open, right? In closing, what would have happened, for instance, if Facebook back in the day actually was also an investor or co-owner in many of the companies it helped grow through the network effect that Facebook facilitated? It wouldn't shut them down. It would have to think more broadly, more holistically about the ecosystem. But because it really didn't have skin in the game and it really didn't care about that, it just sort of took the network effect of all the companies that helped build it, like the Zyngas or whichever many application companies out there, and it basically changed rules. And the same is true with the App Store today. Every single company that's making an app on the App Store is making Apple more valuable. It's adding to the network effect. But Apple can do whatever it wants because it really loses nothing, really, if you think about it, in its scale and size today, if it hurts them, right? This is obviously not true in a nation state, but it is true today with the platforms. That's what we're trying to prevent. And so that's how we've constructed ourselves this way. And so externally, it might look like, oh, these guys are investing in everything. But from that lens, perhaps it makes more sense then.
That does make sense. Thank you for explaining that. So yeah, on the subject of investments, it was interesting because I was doing a recent story about NFTs, and I reached out to a bunch of companies in different areas of the NFT space, from OpenSea to data firms. And more often than not, when I look closely at the companies, I realized that Animoca had an investment in them. And it was very interesting because one of the data firms was trying to get OpenSea to be one of its customers, and they're all invested by Animoca. So very, very kind of interesting circle. I was thinking about that. And yeah, you have said, I think you said recently that this crypto market, the depressed market right now, you actually see it as a buying opportunity. Some people obviously are staying away. Some investors are afraid of how much further the market will drop. So why do you see it as a buying opportunity right now?
Well, if your lens is the next 10 to 20 years, and you believe that, which we do certainly, that this is the next iteration of the internet. And, I've lived through that as well. I've lived through the growth of mobile business. I mean, I've been, basically building in sort of pre-internet, basically when I was using CompuServe as a kid, all the way to sort of, the early 90s, back in the earliest of days when people were actually using, the Mosaic as a browser, and then eventually sort of like Netscape and so on. That to me is the same cycle. So then investing now or even later isn't a big deal, because I'm not thinking about what happens next year. I'm thinking what happens in the next 10 or 20 years and how that's going to sort of create both opportunity and sort of really, I think, change society as a whole. Now, but if you're trading, for instance, right, and that's different, right? And that's not what we do. But if you're trading and you're trying to sort of, from a token standpoint, trying to find the right market timing to maximize return, well, then timing matters, right? You have to start thinking about sort of, are you investing too early, or is it could possibly go down more, all that kind of stuff, right? So that's a different lens to take from, right? The other one is, of course, VCs typically, and this is again why we're not constructed as a typical VC, because we don't have an LP. We also don't have a fund life cycle, therefore, right? In other words, we can afford to make an investment that, if needs be, can sit there for decades, right? Whereas if you are a VC, you have a fund life. So at the end of a fund life, typically 7 years, you need to show return, right? And if you happen to catch the wrong market timing, you might get stuck, beyond the pass of the fund life. And we've seen what happens. And unfortunately, in the classical VC career, if you've lost money, then that's typically the end of your career from a VC standpoint. Whereas, interesting enough, if you're an entrepreneur, having failed a number of times can sometimes be sort of experience, right? It's like, oh, I've got experience points, therefore I can level up, and therefore I can build a better business, right? So it's a bit different, right? So the penalties, shall we say, of not delivering results from a financial perspective in the financial industry, I think in some ways are greater. So they have to be sort of more sensitive, which when you're managing third people's sort of capital, right? Then perhaps it makes sense that you have to be more vigilant and more cautious in that way, because after all, you're dealing with other people's money as opposed to your own. So I think that's probably the big difference here. Now, for us, where we are today had everything to do with our conviction when we got into the space in late 2017 and 2018, right? I mean, that's when we invested in OpenSea and in Axie Infinity. That's when we brought in the Sandbox. That's when we invested in Decentralized as well, and Wax and in Dapper Labs. And, they were very small check sizes, right? Because one, they weren't big companies, and two, we didn't have a lot of money. So the combination of that, I think people forget that, the first fundraising of OpenSea was, barely $2 million, right? Axie Infinity, the entire round that we led, right, it was 800,000 US. I mean, that was obviously in 2019.
Right, it's much smaller amounts, right? Yeah.
Yes, much smaller amounts. But what I mean, but of course, they were also sort of the coldest of crypto winters, if you think about it, right? I mean, Bitcoin was, hovering at 3,000 or below at some stages, right? Ethereum was less than $80, or and it wasn't like it was rising from those levels. It actually had peaked around 2017, early 2018, and then completely collapsed, in a similar kind of flight of capital, with one big difference. back then, a lot of people left and fled back into fiat. So they basically got out of the crypto scene because the majority of them were really there just for trading, because that's how it started, right? It's more speculative in nature. But today, of course, you have many speculators, but the difference here is that the flight isn't into fiat. The flight is into different kind of crypto. Oh, let me go. If you take a look at, for instance, what's happening to USDC, it's growing in terms of its use cases because everyone's fleeing into USDC. They're not fleeing into fiat, right? For instance. So that's kind of interesting as well, right? Where people aren't leaving crypto. So as a whole, it might mean that certain token ecosystems might be more affected than others. But crypto as a whole, as a blockchain industry, is actually far, far more resilient. And we can see that today, when you see that, Ethereum continues to stay around 2,000-ish, Bitcoin continues to sort of stay around 30,000, while frankly, even the classic financial markets continue to melt down.
So in other words, compared with years ago, what happened last week, the meltdown of Luna and Terra, instead of people leaving crypto, they might have flocked to other stable coins that were collateralized, right? Or they may have they might have saw a buying opportunity in Bitcoin or in Ethereum. That's what you're talking about, right? Rather than fleeing the sector wholesale, they're going within the sector because they still believe in the promise. Is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying. I mean, if you think about it in the classic sense, you could argue that tens of billions of dollars, well, certainly not argue, certainly happened, tens of billions of dollars of value was basically sort of lost or, in some effect withdrawn, if you will, because of what happened to Terra. And now, in a normal sense, that could have a much, much bigger impact. And maybe, a lot of people feared a potential systemic impact. But at this point, unfortunately for those who were affected, that's obviously tragic. But broadly as an industry, very few people felt were affected by that, other than maybe a reduction in some of the other tokens. But again, we're not talking about it's sort of 80-90% wipeout across the board. Not at all, right?
Right. Now, you've talked about how NFTs are the foundation of an open metaverse. Can you explain a little bit more why? And while you're doing that, for the newbie investors who are not invested in NFTs, don't know much about it, but are watching, why would they want to invest in a digital asset that gives them ownership? Why do they want to own a digital asset versus owning a physical thing? I think that is still a barrier that some people have a very hard time figuring out, because people will ask all the time, I can just download that image off the internet. Why do I need to buy it? So can you talk to me about, why NFTs are the foundation of the open metaverse and why it's important to own it versus just downloading it off the internet?
All right. So first, in terms of, what does digital really mean, right? And to certainly for our future society. And I think, for anyone who has children, ask them what they want for Christmas or for their birthday, and it's likely something digital anyway, right? They don't necessarily want that shoe or that fashion item or something. They want something from Roblox or something from Fortnite, they want skin. And the reason they want that,
you must be talking to my children.
Yeah, right. Yes. And often I would say, when you look at, often from my point of view, looking at sort of behavior and desires of our children is really a lens to the future, because that's sort of natural to them. And I think it's one of the reasons why also in technology, everyone focuses a lot on youth, whether it's TikTok, or whether it's gaming, or whatever you want to call it, because they do show really sort of where the future is going in terms of, behavior and desires. Now, what that really shows is that digital persona and digital identity has become far more mainstream, and arguably, maybe for most of us today, is perhaps the more important aspect of our life than our physical one. And by that, I mean that, our social identification and our social sort of status online, how many Instagram followers I have, or how many people are looking at me on like TikTok, or what, am I a famous Redditor or whatever, right? Is going to affect your ability to have a career. It's going to give you sort of, sort of karma points in other areas if you're sort of a strong digital citizen, for instance. So, we're already kind of digitally dependent. The other way to look at that is that what happens to your physical life if you've lost access to your digital sort of services. If you were not on Facebook or Instagram, if you were not able to launch your apps on the App Store, actually your sort of potential as a human is diminished significantly. You can't make friends the same way. You can't operate a business. You are sort of digitally excluded. So when you look at it from that point of view, then we can probably also already establish that our digital presence is, perhaps in many cases more important than our physical one, at least in terms of economic opportunity, perhaps even in terms of human rights, because our voices will be more muted if we're not online. Right. So if you agree with that, then you go to that next sort of point about sort of human interaction and value, which is social identification. And what we do in the physical life, for instance, everything we purchase, not necessarily for value, is to signal who we are, right? I mean, for instance, buying a car, there's a utility for the car, of course. But why do we want to choose a certain kind of car with different price points if all there is if all there was is utility, right? If you end up just going from point A to point B, we should all be just driving cars that look exactly the same and have the same kind of utility, but we don't, because we want to be part of a club, because we're social as creatures, right? As humans, we want to connect, and we want to say we're either in this community or that community. And again, they don't necessarily have to sort of be they don't have to be money related. They just have to be signaling that you're part of a community, that you're part of a society, right? So when you're buying, for instance, and as an example, sort of like a Rolex, for instance, you're definitely making a statement about who you are or what you want to be. If you're choosing to buy a Volkswagen versus a Tesla versus a Ferrari, you're definitely making a statement about who you are. None of these purchases are necessarily sort of great value, or investing lessons here. Right? It's in fact, buying a car is perhaps a terrible investment, but they mean something to you. The clothes we wear, the things we do, these are all social identifiers. So now translate that into the digital world. The digital world functions the same way. If I have a Bored Ape, I'm saying something about myself, right? And what's also interesting is that outside of the culture that comes embedded with it, the rest of the community is drawn to you who also has a Bored Ape. And I liken this also, one of the reasons why metaverse land is so powerful. It's kind of the same thing. If I'm buying, for instance, if I'm buying or I get to live in, say, Tribeca or Beverly Hills, I don't know every person in Beverly Hills. In fact, most of them, I have no idea who they are. But there is already an immediate recognition that happens when I'm part of that particular community. When you talk to someone and say, where do you live? Oh, I live in Beverly Hills. Oh, okay, I live there too. Oh, we know each other. That's great. I mean, and again, there's no particular statement that comes through other than we're part of the same community. I'm now connected with you. And, we can talk in a certain way to each other. And it gives you certain comfort. And it can be both something that you are or that you aspire to, right? That's the point. And what we're really talking about here is sort of embedded network effects again, as I spoke earlier. So when you think of an investing proposition in NFTs, you take a look at the embedded network effects within them. When you're buying sort of, why is real estate more expensive in Menlo Park than, say, somewhere in San Jose, for instance? Because the network effects embedded within Menlo or Silicon Valley, per se, is that much more influential. The kind of people who live there, the soft power that exists, right? All these things matter. And they create a network effect, which is why real estate is more valuable there than, say, in the middle of Africa, right? Because, when you're buying something like that, you can buy perhaps a much bigger physical house with much more sort of comfort trappings, as it were, somewhere around the world. But yet we choose to perhaps live in, say, New York City or in Hong Kong, which are sort of cramped apartments. But we choose to live there because of the network effects that bind us there. These network effects, again, don't have to be just value constructs in terms of monetary value. They could be family, they could be culture, they could be all these things. So for someone who sort of isn't yet exposed to NFTs, I think the first thing I always tell people is don't necessarily look at it from a purely financial aspect. You can, like people who buy real estate, obviously buy it also because they think of it as investment, but they also buy it primarily because they plan to use it perhaps, or because there's some kind of other use that they see with it. NFTs are kind of similar that way as well, right? If you're part of if you're buying an NFT, you're part of a community. And the investment proposition looks often today, especially because we're early, into the prospects of how much more deeper do the network effects get built on them, right? It's a little bit like, in the early days, if you're buying sort of real estate, 200 years ago, you're like, should I buy real estate in New York or should I buy real estate in Chicago? I don't know. But, all these places look like, smart people are building there, stuff's happening. So long-term, maybe that should be good. That's kind of where this is right now. So it's hard to sort of make definitive statements on them, with one big difference. When you have ownership, you can actually have a say, and you would actually have, as a community, an ability to direct its future. And that's actually the real powerful paradigm here. Because when you have ownership of something, you now have the freedom of creating your own network effects on top of it. So you can add value. Whereas if you don't own it, you can't do that. Or if you do it on borrowed land, which means you're adding network effects to someone else's value, which eventually, they take away from you. In Hong Kong, one of the big tragedies, for instance, is in this example, is the restaurant industry. Because land is so expensive, most restaurants, also because they don't really understand sort of the financial constructs back in the day, are renting the real estate. But what happens? The restaurant builds value. They bring on all the customers. The area becomes popular, right? And then 2 years later, the landlord says, "Thank you so much. Here's 30% more rent," right? Now, who's added value to this? In reality, the value was created by the person operating the restaurant. But he ends up becoming a slave to the landlord inadvertently, and creates another kind of almost quasi-feudal relationship here, because he constantly has to pay rent. Now, in some countries like Germany, you would have rent controls. You can't do that because they recognize that it's an issue. But in other ones that are hyper-capitalist, like Hong Kong, or perhaps the US as well in some places, they will constantly increase the rent. And so you're constantly working for the landlord. Now, if you have ownership in this, in this case, the restaurant owner actually builds and invests in the stake that he's making better, because he's creating the network effect, or he or she is creating that network effect. And that's the power here. And that also means that if you have that ownership, you now have the ability to sort of construct value and invite others. And if the rest of your community also has ownership, then actually you start becoming almost like a country, right? Or you have governance where you talk about, let's go in that direction. Like, when there's a problem, politics aside, in a district, the community gets together because there's something at stake, right? If I don't own it, then I perhaps don't care about what's going on. That relationship is very clear when you're renting a place versus when you own a place. But when you own a place, you invest in it. You put things in there that is meant to last, and you care about the health of your community. If you rent something, you're there for a year or two, maybe longer, but you're not as embedded to the community because you think that you're moving on. You're not invested in it. And you can see that also in the sort of the wear and tear and care that people give to rental properties versus properties that you own, for instance, right? So that sort of relationship starts to embed as well. So I think, digital ownership does that for us in the context of the metaverse, and I think is very important in order to scale and create community ownership and community governance.
Very, very interesting points, Yat. As you were speaking, I saw a lot of people joining. So I just wanted to summarize 3 interesting points you just made for people who just joined. The question to Yat was, why invest in NFTs if you could just download the image? And what is the importance? Why are they the foundation of an open metaverse? And 3 interesting points you made there, Yat, was 1, you have to look at it through the lens of a child, which I have not thought of. But when my daughter just had her birthday, she did indeed ask for Roblox credit. So that was a very interesting point that you just made. Also, the other thing you mentioned about, why own NFTs is when you have ownership of something, you actually have a say in the community. You actually have the ability to direct its future. So I thought that was very interesting. Audience members, as Yat is speaking, if you have a question and you hear something interesting that he said, you would like to signal to our producers that you have a question, you want to hit the react button on the bottom right of your screen. It will prompt you to type an emoji, choose an emoji, and you can actually type your question to Yak. We'll probably have a time for 2 quick questions, and I have a bunch of audience questions that have already rolled in. Okay, so yeah, we have so many questions for you. We're not going to keep you up all night, but let's talk a little bit more about the NFT world. Yeah, the NFT world and the crypto world in general, they're not without their problems. Wash trading and investment scams have been a part of this world since it began. And to be fair, it's a part of the traditional financial world. It's part of every world where people are looking to make some money. Okay, I know that the NFT world and the crypto world, they are trying to address this, and some of the companies that you've invested in actually are looking at data to filter out wash trading, trying to present to investors a truer picture to inspire confidence in the market. So, how do you think about the issue of wash trading and also investment scams in the NFT world and the crypto world in general? And do you worry that some of these issues could deter investors who don't understand the space and just see some of these problems out there and think, you know what, this is freaking me out, I'm staying away?
So when you think about any economy that's growing, and we think of the activities that are happening in the metaverse as like a new nation, right, with economic opportunity and sort of capitalist prospects, right? Then you will always have, of course, people coming in that will try to take advantage of it because there's money involved, unfortunately. But it's a matter of ratio, right? And so one could argue that perhaps 4 years ago, back when the ICO sort of boom was at its height, there were a lot of people who really just saw it as a quick rich scheme because they really weren't builders. They were just people who were looking to just basically extract as much as possible and then get out. And we basically sort of saw the consequences of that in a really, really nasty crypto winter, right? People talk about a crypto winter today, and it doesn't, certainly the ones who experience, ones of us that have experienced it 4 years ago, right, that don't think of what we have today at all as a winter. It's a bit chilly, but it's certainly not a winter in comparison to where it was 4 years ago. But the other part, of course, is like, when you compare that to early nation growth, like for instance, China 20, 30 years ago, right? China grew tremendously, lots of opportunity, growth, actually, I think the last stat was like close to 800 million people in China were basically lifted out of poverty through all the sort of activities that took place there. That's amazing. But of course, there were many scandals as well. There were many people who did things that took advantage, fake milk, forests that didn't exist, like all the all the things that used to make the headlines before were as China was growing rapidly, was also dealing with things like counterfeit and all these things that China in the early days had a reputation for, which of course ultimately became cleaned up to have a more healthier economy and to have trust in the system. The same is true here. Right? So we're at the point where the space is growing and more responsible players are entering. And so it's also getting harder and harder because, and this is a difference though, is that instead of a central authority that is trying to keep people accountable, actually the decentralized nature is keeping people accountable in a different way. For instance, if you've been involved in many projects that turned out to be sort of bad, then your ability to launch another NFT project becomes harder, right? The trust of sort of launching a project with sort of doxed versus non-doxed founders as an anonymous people is becoming less and less of a thing right now, because everyone like, how can I trust you if I don't know who you are? Which certainly 3 or 4 years ago, the entire ethos was, oh, you have to be anonymous. Don't, that's cool, right? And so again, this is sort of a maturation process. One of the criticisms that, of course, we've been receiving has been around the fact that we have started to sort of require a KYC amongst many of our projects. And the reason we do this isn't just because of the fact that we want to make sure that you're not a money launderer, likely you're not anyway, but it's also to identify identities, at least we don't know who they are, but that there's a certain level of accountability for that action that takes place. Because on one hand, we've seen on the internet that if you have absolute anonymity, then actually that can also be abused, right? And so this is sort of another way of saying, okay, I'm a good actor, I'm a good player in this field, right? It's verified. We still don't have all any of that information because it's handled and then destroyed by basically a third party provider, but there's a level of accountability that comes into place, right? And again, it's not perfect, but it's all part of sort of trying to sort of create a more transparent and sort of friendly lens around that, right? So the other one, of course, is education, which is again true as well, right? It's like investing in China. If you want to invest in China, you got to be educated, right? And again, the ones who ended up sort of struggling with investments in emerging markets like China back in the day are the ones who basically just went in and invested just because, right? And I give the comparison to China a lot because China was one of those places where many sort of international investors really wanted exposure to the China market, but didn't understand it, never visited it, right? They just wanted to sort of invest in companies that sort of were China exposed because they wanted to sort of enjoy part of the growth, and that typically doesn't end up too well for them because they actually don't know what they're investing in. And so the same is true again for NFTs. If you want to invest in a landscape, but you got to treat it like buying a car. Most of us are not in a position to walk into a store and walk out owning a car within 5 minutes, right? And yet, sometimes, often in the NFT space, it seems to feel that way because people are sort of investing based on assumed momentum. But actually, if you study it like you purchase a car, then or artwork, for instance, like in the physical world, then you can actually sort of be informed about it. And again, it's a long-term picture. So if you end up liking something or you're investing in it for what you believe is fundamental to you, then the monetary aspect of it isn't the most important thing at start. It means you join the community, you talk to your friends, you learn about it, and then at the end of the day, you're making an informed decision as a purchase. But through that process, you also form your own thesis and your own ideas that you want to invest in an NFT. Now, you're just quickly talking about sort of the authenticity aspect of NFTs. As I said earlier, when you buy something that has an on-chain record, you can instantly verify that you're part of that membership, right? And for people not in the space, sometimes they confuse that with, especially non-crypto guys, it's like, oh, right-click save, right? I can just download the JPEG and I can just basically, don't I just have the same image? Well, that's first of all in the assumption that that's all there is to it, which isn't the case, right? Because you can't have interoperability, you can't use it as membership, you can't get an ApeCoin drop, for instance, right? If you happen to have a fake, a sort of a fake JPEG. But just like in the physical world, when people buy fakes, like a fake Birkin bag or a fake Rolex, they're doing it because they want to. They're not doing it because they want to have a fake Rolex. They're doing it because they want to signal to be part of an authentic community, and they just want to pretend to be there, right? So that's the difference here, right? Which is the human emotion is the same. Blockchain just elucidates that in a really big way. And so the other thing, of course, is that in the same vein, just as we, for instance, buy real estate or as we buy sort of a Rolex, we start to create sort of our own emotional sort of bindings to it. We add our own quasi-network effects that might become much more deeper. And you see that when you think about people having NFTs, that they feel sorry when they sell it. Sometimes they can't sell it because they have emotional attachments to it. That happens to us in the physical world all the time. I've worn this watch for 10 years and, oh my goodness, it's worth 10 times more now. But do I want to really sell it? Financially, economically, it makes sense. But emotionally, actually, it becomes painful because it means something so much more to you. Because as humans, social identification isn't just something that we buy into. It's something we create for ourselves. Because everything is a culture. The cultures can be large, like a country, like a nation that we all share. But the cultures can also be specific just to our family, right? Like a wedding ring, for instance, is a very cultural icon in your family only, right? And the wedding ring in and of itself is not going to be valuable to most people in the world. But to you and your family, it is absolutely priceless, right? So we attach these things to that. And what it really means is beyond sort of identity and sort of social signaling and perhaps even conspicuous consumption, it's also legacy, right? When I'm passing on something to my children, from items and assets and real estate, I'm not actually just doing it for economic gain. I'm also doing it because I want to pass on a part of our legacy. And that's kind of where physical property rights are interesting because you can pass that transition. We start forming attachments to a land or to a legacy or a history around that because of this, which is, by the way, not something that wasn't possible in digital worlds. If I play Ultima Online back in the day, everything that I built in that game, all the identities that I have and the stories that I created are lost and only live in my memory because of the fact that the game shut down, for instance. So that now becomes attached as well. So NFTs are really sort of representing all of that and more, which is why it's so important. And NFTs ultimately can be looked at perhaps because of its social and cultural context, because it stores culture digitally so well, is perhaps the most human aspect of what we see in the sort of cryptographic world through blockchain. Because fungible tokens are, by its nature, very financially oriented, which serve a purpose, but don't necessarily make them as human as something as individual and scarce as non-fungible tokens.
So, but yeah, with the problem like wash trading or some of the scams going on in the NFT world, you mentioned a very good point. It's buyer beware. You shouldn't just invest in an NFT because you want the space. You need to really do your research. But do you think these problems will get better? And do you think the industry is doing enough to tackle them?
So as an industry, certainly ourselves and many of us are trying to tackle this in many ways, right? I think one of them, of course, is how we invest, right? From our perspective is, when we invest in projects, that to us is a kind of signaling. Eventually this will happen as well, where people want to, projects, this is what we think will happen. Projects that are backed, for instance, by certain groups of sort of investors is a way to confirm that they're real, that the due diligence has happened, that they're authentic. Whether it's a success or not is maybe one thing, but it's not going to be a rug pull, or somebody's not going to scam them, because at least there's someone that's accountable towards it, or there's an avenue of some place or another, right? So that's kind of sort of one example. And again, more and more people are looking towards that as well. People are saying, it's invested by these people, or hey, these are actual people involved. More and more sort of feedback and is coming through to us where like people are asking us for verification. Oh, did you actually invest in this company? Should I, and these are not people that we know, but they're asking us these questions clearly because it's part of their due diligence process. So as time goes on, this type of stuff will scale more and will be more transparent. And there's also, if you think about what's happening with groups like CryptoSlam and so on, right, which we've also invested in, is the old sort of creating frameworks in which we can learn more information and have more data insights and create essentially like rating agencies as well, where people can start sort of give evaluations. But right now they're getting them from influencers, right? Back in the day, everyone was like, this influencer said it, let's go buy it. Today, those influencers that have basically sort of promoted bad projects, not so much, right? They've burnt that bridge already, right? And so that's kind of evolving, right? And I think, again, we're at an early stage, but this will continue to grow. There will be an element of self-policing, but at the end of the day, regulation will also come into play, right? Meaning that those type of projects where people really sort of hurt the community in a bad way, when you do that, you don't just take money. It's almost like theft, right? What you're doing is the entire community itself starts to band against you. And that actually becomes the part that perhaps most people who sort of are thinking in sort of more sort of scam or scam-like ways are going to find is going to be very problematic, because you're not actually fighting, a business group, for instance. You're fighting an entire community who's going to go run after you and find ways and look at your on-chain transactions. And again, back, if someone steals something from a bank, well, the counterparty is the bank, which is the bank has to follow it up and use its bureaucracy to chase that, because the customer that might have been affected has no idea of knowing what's going on. But an on-chain transaction is entirely transparent, so everyone else can start analyzing it. Like, for instance, with the Ronin hack, what I tell people is that you've not just sort of stolen from Sky Mavis or Axie Infinity as a community, Axie Infinity as a game. You've stolen from the entire community, and everyone is looking at that wallet like a hawk, right? and is incentivized to try to catch you and identify you or sort of stop you, right? So when you do something like this, you're actually not just sort of taking from a company, you're taking from the entire community, and you make an enemy of the entire community. That to us is what the natural sort of evolution will evolve to. And as we become stronger and better at analyzing, we end up creating a situation where it becomes almost impossible to get away with theft.
Okay. Yeah, we have a bunch of audience questions for you. I am well aware it is now 4:30 a.m. in Hong Kong. So let me ask you these questions. Let me remind the audience how to ask questions. If you don't mind just staying with us for 5 to 10 more minutes,
Of
that would
course.
be great. Does that work for you yet?
Yes, of course.
Okay, audience members, now is the time to ask Yak questions. If you would like to ask him a question, please hit the react button on the bottom right of your screen. You're going to select an emoji and type in your question, and we will entertain maybe one or two questions for you. Let me go to some of the audience questions that have already been sent in, if you don't mind. Um,
Of course.
to get to as many as possible, if you don't mind keeping your answer to a minute, then we can get to maybe a few audience questions. If that's not possible, that's totally fine too. I'm just worried about your sleep time here. So, excuse me. One question we had yet is about blockchain games. Okay, this audience member sent me a question asking, and I'll quote from his email: "Why in God's green earth would a game need to be on the blockchain?" I'll let you answer that.
I'm afraid this is a hard one to answer in just 1 minute.
Okay,
But
however
but
long you'd
first of
like.
all, but first of all, it goes back to the principle of digital ownership, right? Which is that so to think about how games work today, most games, especially free to play, less than sort of 3%, typically on average 1%, 1.5% of the users actually convert into paying customers, which means that 97 to 99% of players play entirely for free. And if you play mobile games, you've probably likely never paid any money, right? But someone else within the network has paid money. And so what you do when you actually are playing the game for free is you're adding to the network effect, and you're offering value to the game. Because if you stop playing the game, then the person who might pay has nobody to play with, and therefore, he'll stop playing, sort of paying. So it's actually the network effect that's being shared across. So introducing blockchain basically creates, through a tokenizing framework, and a true economy, not a fake economy as we see in the games, within that environment. So it gives you, beyond sort of the ownership paradigm, the ability to sort of distribute the economic energy that already exists inside that game. Now, it's always good to look back at sort of country examples, because I look at games like mini nations, because there are communities, sometimes of millions of users, that come together and form a consensus of some sort. Except in this case, it's a kingdom, because people decide what to do there. The game company decides what to do there. It's not actually the players. And what's interesting is that just like in a physical country, every physical country that has strong property rights has a strong GDP. Every country that has no property rights or very limited property rights has low economic output. The most extreme example would be like North Korea versus the US, for instance, right? But even the countries that have unstable property rights, say some countries that have sort of in Africa that may have sort of constant government switches, or the lack of certainty of these property rights means that new economic constructs don't become possible, right? And finally, from a game developer and a game player standpoint, as a result, you have large capital inefficiencies, which means the value of the content that you're creating, which are assets in blockchain, is much less, because it's a rental construct. So in a gaming environment, the value that you're generating in a rental construct might only be worth tens of dollars, just because you don't own that. But just like in the physical world, when you're renting a property, you don't expect to buy it for 2 times rent. You understand the long-term capital benefits around that and you could sell on, or that you can mortgage, or whatever constructs that come on top of it, which is why it's worth 20, 30, 40x of that. And so what that creates is capital efficiencies and a stronger economic model. From a gaming standpoint, that means that as a game creator, your ARPU goes up, right? So but from a game player, it means your value is also more, because you can sell the item to someone else if you wanted to, as an example. Now, what that means is that you can make very successful games with only tens of thousands of users. Now, that to me is the real sort of macro benefit here. Because one of the struggles we have with Web 2, and this is not just true for gaming, it's true for everything Web 2, but gaming as an example, is that we need to have millions of users play a game in order to be even moderately profitable because of the model of the economics surrounded around it. But if you look at blockchain games, actually the biggest blockchain games really only have hundreds of thousands of daily active users for the most part, right? Or maybe low millions. Yet they drive economies worth billions. That's because there's more capital efficiencies and the ARPU value per customer is so much larger. Now, what that means is that now we have a framework where we can have more diverse content that is not dependent on creating a game that has only mass appeal. I liken this to a little bit like the restaurant industry. If the only kind of food that we can consume is the one that can be consumed by 10 million customers at any given time, right? Then it would mean the death of Michelin star restaurants. It would mean the death of food experiences. It would mean death of food diversity as a whole, because you can't scale as a model. It just doesn't work. And yet in that industry, because we're willing to pay for it and give value, we can actually have a diverse and rich industry, because you can basically have only sort of a single restaurant that might only cater to thousands of customers a year and be sort of an endeavor of passion, but is still sustainable. And I see this in the music industry, which is how I grew up, right? Yeah, I'm studying classical music. Classical music is almost entirely erased because Spotify has no way of bringing it up, because it treats every stream the same. Right? Therefore, Spotify has an incentive to promote, mass music, because that's the appeal process, which means that a classical music track is treated exactly the same as a track by Justin Bieber. And Justin Bieber is great and everything, right? But the audiences are different, and the value constructs of his audience might be different, but it's still treated the same because the platform only knows one answer. And next thing you know, everyone's gearing towards, how do I get to a billion streams? That means I have to go towards everything that is mainstream in direction, and I can't experiment, because every experiment becomes sort of a financial risk, for instance, right? So the economics are better for the player. The economics are better for the game studio. It gives rise to more diversity, right? Ownership as a paradigm gives you a voice and actually protects your interests as a player. There's so many benefits. I could go on and on and on, but these are just some examples as to why blockchain in games are just critical, and therefore we think the future.
Okay, thank you for answering that audience question. I think we have a question from a fireside audience. I think Allison has a question. Victoria, do you want to take it away? Hi, Victoria,
Hi, Allison,
are you there?
go ahead yes, I am. Allison, I'm going to go ahead and invite you up, and feel free to accept so that you can ask your question regarding any.
Okay, Allison, we've invited you to speak. You can ask your question directly of Yat. Are you there, Allison? Okay, I'm not sure this is working. Okay, yeah, we'll come back to Allison. Let me ask you another audience question, and if you're able to answer these in a minute or less, that would be great. If not, feel free to answer as long as long as you'd like. I'm just worried about your sleep here.
Sure.
Is Elon's bid? Okay, let me read this audience question. Is Elon's bid for Twitter just a show, or how is it going to affect Web3 content?
To ask anyone to sort of peer into Elon's mind is a game in and of itself, right? Which is probably
That's tough, right?
He's constructed anyway. So, I think I don't really. So first of all, I think that Elon, obviously, I think he has some strong ideas as to where Twitter should be going. And he described Twitter basically as sort of this mass town hall, which everyone should have voice in, which is necessary, and that's good. But I think on the media side, I think he'll try to make it more open in the image that he sees. is he going to be the kind of person that is going to let it sort of really run freely by itself? That's a test, I would say, because everything I've seen of Elon, at least publicly so far, is that he is one who takes charge, and he's one who sort of takes control of things. If you think about sort of SpaceX and Tesla, and frankly, the nature of most very strong-willed and successful entrepreneurs are the ones sort of who take control. And I actually think that Twitter, in a way, is almost a public service. And in that sense, as a public service, is it the right thing to have someone who takes charge of it in quite the same way, or do you sort of let the community drive it more, right? In fact, I think Twitter is an ideal audience, so an ideal sort of product that could be turned into like a DAO structure, where the community itself should have a voice as to where it goes. I think that would be quite powerful. But I mean, it's a bit of a guess, and also with all the drama that's unfolding, I'm not entirely sure that the transaction will necessarily take place anymore. And perhaps in some ways you could say that his goal to sort of create awareness around this and sort of peer into Twitter, maybe his goal has already been quasi achieved without buying the company itself. Certainly cheaper,
But
perhaps.
if it does go through, will it affect Web3 content quite a bit? Do you expect it to really change the world of Web3?
I actually am not sure it will change the world of Web3, because I think Web3
Okay.
itself is already using Twitter and Discord and so on. I think alternatives will emerge that are going to be on-chain in nature. Like for instance, all the hacks that are taking place in Discord is sort of just accelerating the need to create sort of an on-chain mechanism that is more safe.
Okay, fantastic. We will take Allison's question. Victoria, would you like to read her question for Yat?
So her question started off with a statement. It says, it seems like some NFT projects don't have a clear vision of what they want to do with their community. There are a lot of more coming soon and merch. How is a newer person to the industry supposed to navigate the space when it seems like many projects don't have substance besides the unaffordable blue chips?
All right. So I think, one of the challenges, of course, is around when you're investing in an NFT project and you think of it as an investment, then you have to sort of consider many factors, right? And I typically, especially if it's one of the ones that don't really have sort of a roadmap. I mean, they have a roadmap, but execution on that has been a quite problem issue, because normally when they execute on the roadmap well, then maybe the value of the NFT has gone up because they've demonstrated sort of network effects, and then at that point it becomes too expensive, right? So how do you identify that? I think one of the easiest ways to identify that is to look at the community that actually is there. An NFT project is bigger than the creators themselves, a good one anyway, right? If you're entirely reliant on the sort of original creator to sort of make it work, then you are kind of sort of really taking a bet, unless you know them or you have insights to them, right? Or you trust them, right? But if you know that the community that owns it, and that's not foolproof, but if you know the community that owns it is very passionate, is very driven, and perhaps is recognized in and of itself, then that actually is a way in which you can ensure some level of security that the project is at least sort of serious, shall we say, right? Whether they succeed or not is anyone's guess, but at least they are serious in trying to make it work, because they'll hold them accountable, right? It's like, which community members are vocal, are strong, or have good ideas. Now, what's also interesting is that even if a project itself might fail, if you have a strong community, they will continue to sort of lift the product up. They will continue to maybe invest in their own way if they can, because they have skin in the game, because they will ultimately become co-owners of the project by owning the NFT. So looking at the community itself and who's involved is one good way, I think, to in the absence of any other information, as to how you can sort of do sort of a kind of community due diligence, as it were. I think of it as an example, like visiting a country, or visiting if you visit a country, it's very hard for you to discern the insides of the economics very well. But you'll get a feel as to the people who live there. Are they nice? Are they friendly? Are they smart? That kind of stuff, right? And that might give you at least one inkling as to the strength of the project.
Okay, great. Yeah, one last question for you from the audience. What do you see as the future of DAOs? The DAOs being
Well,
decentralized autonomous
yes,
organizations. Do you think that this will, do you think that they will evolve? Do you think they have a very promising future? And, you know, where do you see them going?
I'm really excited about DAOs. I think DAOs are the future. But of course, the way that DAOs are constructed right now are still up to a big learning curve. And the criticisms around DAO is that, oh, does this mean that every decision has to be sort of community led, and therefore we're going to sort of be paralyzed because nobody will ever decide on anything, right? That's kind of one of the criticisms around DAOs. But I actually think DAOs are exciting because it allows us to iterate on sort of democratic principles, but at the rate of technology. One of the big challenges we have in the physical world is that if we want to iterate on a democratic system, the consequence of doing so badly has very devastating consequences, right? Because if you screw around with it, then you affect people's lives in very material ways. But if you can iterate it, like in a technological MVP approach, that DAOs allow you to do, for instance, not all of them will succeed, of course, then you can actually learn something. So I actually think that sort of democracies in the physical world will sort of evolve and advance because they can look at DAO structures and say, hey, that system worked actually much better than we thought. Maybe we should adopt some principles around that because if you think about it, every blockchain game in the world, every layer one, layer two, all these systems will ultimately sort of run into some kind of DAO, and some will work and some won't. And so we can learn some interesting lessons around that. I think the other thing is what I like about DAOs as well is that it broadly introduces more knowledge around the democratic process, which has been, if you think about it, taken for granted for the most part, because most people feel like they don't have a stake. If we all understood the value of democracy, then voting turnouts would be far, far greater than barely 50%. But we don't. And we also feel helpless because we're like, well, my vote doesn't count. So why do I even bother? This is particularly amplified in disenfranchised communities because they really feel like they don't matter and therefore their vote is meaningless. The DAO concentrates that into small community processes where that vote matters. In some ways, in a micro way, your family is a DAO, right? Everything you build around it is a consensus, right? I could buy something, but if I don't consult my wife, she might be very upset at me, right? And the consequences could be very dire too, right? So it's the same sort of setup, but now just larger. And if you start to appreciate that actually your voice matters, even in the smallest of ways, because my voice matters in this game, or my voice matters in the ApeCoin community, and I have influence, then you start actually recognizing that yourself, your sovereignty is valuable. And actually, the broader democratic principle is important too. My voice doesn't just matter to my family or to sort of maybe this game I'm involved in or whatever. My voice matters to my community, to my country. So these are things that I'm excited about and why I think broadly DAOs are a real positive force, but it will take some time.
Well, yeah, thank you so much for your insight today. We really appreciate your time. This has been a very stimulating conversation. Good questions from the audience, even some of the hard questions that were hard to answer, provide an insight into how people are thinking about this world today. Thank you to the audience for joining us on Crypto Defined. Crypto Defined takes place every Thursday at 12:30 p.m. Pacific time. Please join us next week for our next guest. And we will have a recap on Yat Su, the co-founder of Animoca Brands and investor in more than 200 companies in the NFT space. We will have a recap on Yat Su online at TruthDAO.xyz this coming Monday. Thank you so much, Yat. Great having you.